Welcome back to our journey into the most haunting hidden corners of military history. Today, we will not only talk about glorious victories or shining medals, we will step into the mind of a soldier, where numbers are not merely statistics but ghosts that linger for a lifetime. This is the story of Evan Evans and the fateful 27 minutes on Renova Island in 1943. In the pitch-black darkness of the shelter in the early hours of July 4th, the only sound that existed was not the waves of the Blanche Strait, but the steady, merciless ticking of the stopwatch in the hand of Private Evan Evans. For an artilleryman, at suicide point time was not measured in hours or minutes, but in the counted beats of approaching death. Evans crouched behind damp sandbags, his hands moving unconsciously over the cold steel body of the 90mm anti-aircraft gun. He had polished it until the gray-green paint gleamed faintly in the dim light, a repetitive act like a religious ritual to steady his mind before a harsh reality. Renova Island now appeared like a muddy hell where every step was sucked down by soggy clay and despair. For the past 3 weeks, the sky above them had not belonged to the Americans. Evans was haunted by the accumulating numbers of failure in his mind. 59 Marines had fallen just 2 days earlier, right on this very beach. 18 Japanese bombers had turned the place into a sea of fire without encountering any significant resistance. A broken radar system had rendered their most modern guns into blind giants. Evans remembered the helpless feeling of watching his comrades run into the flames to rescue the wounded, only to become part of the ashes themselves. The greatest problem was not the fear of death, but the invisibility of the enemy. Japanese aircraft emerged from the clouds, unleashed destruction, and vanished before anyone could even fix their position. Evans had fired 32 rounds during the previous air raid, but each 24-pound shell rose into the sky, only to burst meaninglessly in the vast emptiness. The perfect zero in the column of enemy aircraft shot down was a bleeding wound in the young soldier's pride. He began to doubt everything he had been trained to believe. Precision ballistic calculations, even the mechanical Sperry M4 computer, all seemed like useless piles of scrap metal without input data. The sense of isolation at the northern tip of Renova only intensified the pressure. Every supply ship, every source of food and ammunition had to pass through their field of view, and every time black smoke rose from the harbor, Evans felt as though a part of his soul had been lost. He looked at his gun crew, the men sprawled beside ammunition crates, their eyes sunken from lack of sleep and prolonged nervous strain. They did not speak. In war, words often become redundant when casualty numbers speak for themselves. Evans kept counting. He counted every passing second, counted the intact sandbags, and counted his own shallow breaths. He understood that this silence was merely a veil before an approaching storm, and this time, if the numbers did not change, there might be no one left to continue recording history. The heavy tropical rain finally stopped at dawn, leaving behind air thick with humidity and the smell of corroded metal. But the dryness brought no relief. Instead, it introduced a new obsession. At 7 o'clock, a group of mud-splattered technicians shouted to one another around like the CR-268 radar set. After many sleepless nights with complex circuit diagrams and scavenged components, they had created what Evans called a grotesque patchwork. Thick electrical cables writhing like black snakes crawled from the radar station across puddles to connect directly to the Sperry M4 fire control computer. This was not a sleek upgrade. It was an awkward marriage between two generations of technology never designed for each other. Evans watched the connection with cold skepticism. He felt a change in the unit's operational structure. Before, he had scanned the sky with naked eyes and binoculars, searching for tangible black dots. Now his world had narrowed to dancing numbers on a radar screen and the dry mechanical clatter of the M4 computer. Operations officers began barking new command strings of characters and numbers. Azimuth, 320 degrees altitude, 14,000 feet, wind speed, 12 knots. Evans and his crew were pulled into a vortex of calculations. They were no longer allowed to think like humans. They had to react like transistors. Each radar sweep sent back faint electrical signals, and the M4 computer, a heavy mechanical beast, struggled to digest the data and produce a firing solution. Evans placed his hand on the adjustment crank, feeling the vibration of the gears inside. There was a strange psychological tension in trusting something he could not see. The radar said the enemy was there dozens of miles away, yet the sky before him remained deceptively empty and blue. This dependence made him feel suffocated. He was entrusting his life and his comrades' lives to a fire control system where a single moisture-shortened cable could turn them all into practice targets for the Japanese. The obsession with numbers began to invade Evans's mind more deeply. He started calculating probabilities. If the mechanical computer lagged by 2 seconds and the enemy aircraft traveled at 270 miles per hour, how many meters would his shell miss the target? The numbers spun like tops in his head, creating crushing mental pressure. He glanced at Roy Boone and Gamborowski, who were checking the timed fuses on the shells. They too moved mechanically, eyes fixed on measurement scales. There were no more jokes, no more stories about home in Indiana. They had become part of the fire control system, living entities programmed to load shells and set fuses in under 3 seconds. The moment the SCR-268 radar signaled green, a jolt ran down Evans's spine. It was not the joy of readiness, but fear of an overwhelming responsibility. The system promised precision, but precision in war always came at a blood-soaked price. He knew that once the guns fired, there would be no turning back. He would have to maintain an impossible rate of fire to compensate for mechanical errors. The number 12,000 feet repeated in his mind like a war drum. Evans tightened his grip on the crank, his eyes burning with painful resolve. He was ready to become part of the machine, yet he wondered whether his soul could bear the weight of the deadly calculations ahead. At 8:45, the island's silence was torn apart by the shrill alarm bell, signaling that the bright dots on the radar screen had become real entities. Distance 120 miles, bearing 320 degrees. For Evans, these numbers were no longer abstract data. They were the heartbeat of a war machine racing straight toward him. He jumped into the gunner's position, his hands gripping the metal crank that had already begun to heat under the morning sun. This was the moment when the mechanical dance began, a brutal process where every movement had to achieve the absolute perfection of a clock gear. Evans no longer saw blue skies or white clouds. His vision was framed by the concentric rings of the sight and the numbers dancing on the control panel. The commander's voice came steadily through the speaking tube, reporting the closing distance: 80 miles, 60 miles, 40 miles. In Evans's mind, an internal rhythm formed. Load set, fuse fire, 3 seconds. His entire world now shrank to that fateful 3-second interval. He felt the weight of the 24-pound shell as Roy Boone transferred it from the rack, a smooth and ruthless motion like an assembly line in Detroit factories, except what they produced here was destruction. The obsession with numbers peaked as the M4 mechanical computer began to groan under the pressure of radar data. The clatter of its trajectory calculating gears sounded in Evans's ears like a grotesque symphony. He had to adjust the crank by millimeters to match the computer's indicators. A hair's breadth of error on the ground would translate into hundreds of meters of deviation, 10,000 feet in the air. Evans pressed his lips together, sweat streaming into his eyes, but he dared not blink. He was trying to merge his will with the precision of steel. He was no longer Evan Evans. He was an organic extension of the fire control system. Every breath of the gun crew now synchronized with the rhythm of the 90mm gun. Gamborowski set the fuse with the precision of a watchmaker, gently turning the ring to adjust the detonation, timed to half-second increments. 18 seconds of flight, 17.5 seconds, 17 seconds. These numbers marked the boundary between a hit and a meaningless waste of ammunition. Evans felt the tension radiating from his comrades. They did not look at one another or signal, because every movement had been drilled 10,000 times until it became muscle memory. This discipline was no longer a source of military pride, but a brutal survival mechanism against the chaos of war. As the Japanese bomber formation entered effective range, a strange emptiness enveloped Evans's mind. He no longer felt fear or hatred. He felt only the obsession with calculations. He was waiting for the final number, the firing distance. When the firing order came, the blast from the first shot threw dirt into the air and shook the sandbags. But Evans stood firm like a bronze statue. He had begun counting the firing rhythm. First shot, 3 seconds later the second shot. The mechanical dance had officially begun, and in the vortex of smoke and thunder, Evans realized he had completely vanished, leaving only numbers frantically balancing the equation of life and death. The roar of the 90mm gun was no longer a series of individual sounds. It became a continuous, jarring heartbeat, drowning Evans' senses in a parallel reality. The sky over the Blanche Strait was now shredded by black columns of anti-aircraft smoke. Through the sight, Evans saw the formation of Japanese Betty bombers advancing like giant silver sharks. He did not see humans in those aircraft. He saw only variables to be eliminated. The stopwatch in his mind kept running. Every 3 seconds, another shell left the barrel. Sweat, grease, and gun smoke clung to his skin, forming a sticky mask, but his eyes remained locked on the M4's readouts. This was when the obsession with numbers turned into a physical pressure. Gun number 3 of Battery C began radiating intense heat. The 9-ton steel barrel now expanded under temperatures of thousands of degrees Celsius. Evans could see heat waves rising, warping the target image through the sight. He knew that in theory, maintaining this rate of fire for too long would damage the rifling, rendering all calculations meaningless. But orders from fire control kept coming: 15 miles, 10 miles, 8 miles. He had to choose. On one side was equipment safety, on the other, the survival of the entire island. Evans tightened his grip on the crank, ignoring the burning heat on his hands. He chose the numbers. He chose the probability of destruction. In the 12th minute of the engagement, the lead Betty entered the SCR-268's perfect firing solution. Evans felt the vibration of the mechanical computer as it locked on target. He pulled the trigger. The shell flew at half a mile per second. 18 seconds of waiting stretched like a century. Then a fireball blossomed in the sky. The bomber's right engine exploded, trailing thick black smoke. Evans did not cheer. He felt no excitement. He merely counted silently. 1. One calculation completed. One variable eliminated. But immediately the 3-second count resumed. Load, set, fire. He was racing against an endless death list. Precision had become a horror. Thanks to the awkward radar-computer connection, Evans's crew achieved an unimaginable efficiency: 14%. In artillery terms, it was a devil's number. Each shot now carried the weight of fate. Evans saw other aircraft begin descending, trying to escape the numerical net, but the fire control system allowed no escape. It tracked them like a cold hunter, calculating every millimeter of wind drift and air pressure change. Evans felt as though he were wielding an invisible scythe, harvesting lives from the sky based on mathematical algorithms. As the attack reached its climax, Evans realized he had completely lost his sense of self. He no longer felt pain in his burned hands, nor heard the shouts of comrades around him. He had become pure consciousness in service of the gun. He lived in a universe of coordinates and fuse times. Each shell detonating in midair solved another equation. These 27 minutes were a mathematical execution where the courage of Japanese pilots was utterly irrelevant. Through the smoke, Evans watched the third, then the fourth aircraft plunge into the sea. He kept counting to keep himself from going mad amid the destruction he was creating. By the 20th minute, the sky was no longer a battlefield. It had become a programmed slaughterhouse. The Japanese formation, once famed for discipline and pride, completely disintegrated. The remaining Bettys attempted sharp turns, sudden dives, or climbs to escape the fire net. But to the SCR-268 radar, these were merely new variables instantly fed into the equation. Evans felt a cold shiver, realizing that no human bravery could compete with machine processing speed. He watched bombers desperately jettison their payloads into empty sea. Huge water plumes erupted uselessly, half a mile offshore, a desperate act by men who knew they were no longer fighting humans but destiny. Orders continued through the headset, ironclad and unforgiving: destroy all. This was when Evans's mental discipline began to collapse. He was firing at men who were fleeing. In the world of numbers, there was no concept of mercy or retreat, only effective range. The 90mm gun had exceeded its tolerance. The barrel glowed an eerie orange-red in the thick smoke. Each reload produced a painful metallic shriek, yet Evans's hands kept turning the crank in the 3-second rhythm. He could not stop. If he stopped, the mathematical rhythm would break and silence would force him to face what he had done. With each bomber exploding, another number was carved into Evans's mind. 7, 8, 9. These numbers grew heavy like lead. He saw a Betty take a direct hit in the bomb bay. The explosion was so violent that debris scattered over half a mile like cruel fireworks under the sun. He knew there were humans inside, pilots with families and fears, but the radar reported only a neutralized target. The obsession with 14% efficiency became a moral burden. He was becoming too good at killing, too precise at destruction, and that perfection disgusted him. The gun crew's discipline began to crack under the brutality. Roy Boone no longer passed shells with a blank face. His breathing was ragged, eyes wild from heat and explosions. Gamborowski set fuses with trembling hands, the numbers on the fuse ring now resembling ancient characters of a death sentence. They had become ghosts operating a divine machine. There was no glory in this moment, only bone-deep exhaustion and a horrifying obsession with becoming part of a mass destruction process. Evans tried to focus on the last fleeing target on the horizon, but in his head the ticking clock had become the pounding of hundreds of hearts about to stop. When the 12th aircraft spiraled into the sea in a flat, desperate dive, Evans realized the complete collapse of so-called chivalrous warfare. This was war of parameters. He had shot down 12 aircraft in under 30 minutes, a record never surpassed, but the only feeling inside him was vast emptiness. He looked at the cooling barrel, its paint scorched and peeling, and realized this precision had changed him forever. He was no longer the soldier defending the island. He had become a mathematician of death using radar and steel to write one of the bloodiest chapters in Pacific skies. The final 3-second count stopped, leaving a silence more terrifying than cannon fire. At 9:32, the ceasefire order was issued. The 90mm gun finally stood still, but for Evans, the world did not return to quiet. A continuous, shrill ringing filled the space, as if the sound of thousands of exploding shells had permanently lodged in his ears. Evans released the now scorched metal crank, his hands trembling uncontrollably, not from fear but from exhaustion, of a machine that had operated beyond capacity. He stepped back, legs unsteady, on ground littered with spent brass casings, feeling as though he had stepped out of another dimension, where time was measured in lost lives. The obsession with numbers shifted into a new, quieter, more terrifying form. Evans looked at the gunner's logbook. 53 shells fired from his gun, 88 shells for the entire unit, 12 aircraft destroyed. These numbers began compounding in his mind. 12 Betty bombers, each carrying a 7-man crew, 84 human beings, gone in 27 minutes. The 14% efficiency the officer celebrated was to Evans a sentence for 84 lives erased under radar guidance. And his hands. He tried to swallow, but his throat burned with gunpowder bitterness and metallic death. Around him, the gun crew collapsed beside the sandbags. Roy Boone sat, dazed eyes fixed on the oil slick on the sea where Japanese wreckage still smoldered. Gamborowski stared at his own hands, as if unable to believe they had just performed such ruthlessly precise fuse operations. There was no victory cheer at Battery C. This silence was torn apart by Evans's ringing ears, a sound reminding him that absolute precision always carries an equivalent loss of humanity. He had become part of the greatest anti-aircraft record in the Pacific. Yet deep inside, he felt he had lost the last innocence of a soldier. The post-battle report began, and every line stabbed Evans's mind like a needle. 90% enemy formation destruction. No bombs hit the island. No American casualties. These numbers were perfect on paper. They testified to radar technology and marine discipline. But Evans could not escape the image of bombers trying to turn back. Before being shredded by his shrapnel, he realized radar did not just reveal the enemy, it stripped them of escape. It turned battle into a problem whose only answer was destruction. His ringing ears felt like an endless indictment filling the space between glorious numbers. When the Seabees began retrieving wreckage from the water, Evans stood up slowly, picked up the cleaning rag, and began wiping the gun again. He did it not out of discipline, but to seek calm in familiar motions. He examined the intact rifling. Despite enduring extreme heat, he felt disgust at steel's endurance. Humans could collapse, souls could shatter under obsession. But machines and numbers could not. They remained cold and precise, ready for the next equation. Evans knew that since July 4th, 1943, he would never again hear true silence. The ringing would be his companion, reminding him of the price of becoming the deadliest gunner in a war of parameters. 5 decades passed. Evan Evans was now a 72-year-old man sitting in a quiet home in Richmond, Indiana. War had retreated into textbooks, but for him, the battle at Renova had never truly ended. Whenever he looked at numbers on Bill's clocks or even calendar dates, part of him automatically performed deadly trajectory calculations. The ringing from that morning of July 4th, 1943 became a silent companion, a constant reminder of 14% efficiency and 84 lives erased in under 30 minutes. Evans lived a quiet life, worked as a mechanic, raised children, but kept memories of Suicide Point locked away in a sealed drawer of the soul, unreachable even by family. Release came unexpectedly in 1993 when he wrote to the National Archives seeking only a photograph of the 90mm gun to show his grandchildren. When archivist Alan Walker sent back photograph number 127, G.W. Evans froze. In the aged black and white image, he saw himself at 22, a young man beside the gun that made history. But what moved him was not the glory of 12 kills, but his own eyes. They were the eyes of someone trapped among numbers, a soldier who traded peace of soul to become part of a precision machine. Seeing the photo, Evans realized he was not alone in that obsession. History had recorded him not only as a gunner, but as a witness to the brutal intersection of humanity and technology. Holding the photograph, Evans felt a quiet transformation. The numbers 12, 88, 14% lost their crushing weight. They were no longer condemning ghosts, but fragments of a closed historical chapter. He realized he had done his duty in an era where precision was the price of freedom. For the first time in 50 years, the ringing in his head seemed to fade, making room for the sigh of relief of someone finally allowed to let go. He placed the photo beside the broken stopwatch and felt true silence. For the first time since the summer of 1943, Evans died 10 years later, carrying the peace of someone who had solved life's hardest equation, the equation of forgiving himself. The story of Evan Evans and the 9th Defense Battalion stands as a testament to courage and human intellect in the face of adversity. It reminds us that behind every dry wartime statistic are lives, pain, and silent sacrifices. We hope that through this journey you have found a new perspective on the value of memory and respect for those who held the line, with blood and reason. Thank you for listening and accompanying us in this emotional story. If you found this content meaningful and value revived history, please subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss future journeys. Your support drives us to continue digging through dusty archives, to rediscover souls forgotten by time. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or tell us stories of soldiers in your family. Goodbye, and see you again in upcoming videos where history will once more find its voice.